Tonight's program is about Team America, Patton, MacArthur, Marshall, Eisenhower, and the World They Forged by Robert O'Connell. And we'll go ahead and get started here. First of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. O'Connell, Robert O'Connell from Charlottesville, Virginia. Glad you're here visiting us tonight.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here. Looking forward to talking about the book.
Good. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Folks, Dr. O'Connell received a PhD in history from the University of Virginia and spent 3 decades as a senior analyst at the National Ground Intelligence Center. And he was also 14 years as a visiting professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. He is the author of numerous books, 2 of which are about General George Washington and General William T. Sherman. And as we were talking earlier, this is kind of the end of the trilogy on these 4 powerful and famous and very influential generals of World War II. So I also wanted to point out that his book on General Sherman was the winner of the 2015 William H. Seward Award for Excellence in Civil War Biography. So we are so glad you're with us this evening, and glad to have you again. Well, let me go ahead and get started with a quick question here. And we're going to be talking tonight about Patton and MacArthur and Eisenhower and Marshall. So can you tell us a little bit about choosing these 4 and what popped out about them to make you want to focus on them?
You know, for me, my writing career has been really kind of defined by aha moments. And in this case, what was happening was I taught a bunch of guys at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey who were largely involved in the Special Forces. And one of my students got in touch with me when I was in Japan, and we kept a kind of close correspondence from that point on. And he was going to come visit me, and he was really interested in writing. And I was looking forward to seeing him, and my wife was too. She knew him. And so anyway, he came down with his new girlfriend, or was on the way. The one problem was that I had absolutely nothing going myself, you know, and I felt like I should at least have my own project working on. And I was standing in the kitchen, and it came to me, Team America, Patton, MacArthur, Marshall, and Eisenhower. And I literally wrote it down, and literally that was the beginning of the book. And it did turn out that there have been somewhat similar books in the sense that they examined 2 or 3 guys. Winston Room, the guy that wrote Forrest Gump. He wrote a book about Patton, MacArthur, and Marshall, but left Eisenhower out, which was to me ridiculous because Eisenhower was the pivot man of the whole situation. So I ended up thinking that was a good idea. And at that point, I put in a proposal, and it seemed to work. And we ended up writing this book. And it was an effort in that, but it really required a lot of orchestration to keep all the characters chronologically in the right order, dealing with each other at the right times. But I was in a strange situation because we all were. I was in the middle of a pandemic, and I more or less got the research done I needed to do before everything closed down. But at that point, everything really did kind of close down for me. and we were pretty isolated as old people. And so we went out once a week to get groceries. The rest of the time, basically, I wrote. And took about a year to finally take it from this vast outline I had to the book.
So after doing the research and then doing the writing, of the four generals, was one of them the glue that held them all together, or did they regard themselves as equals? What was their dynamic as far as a relationship?
Well, there were a number of questions implanted in that. I'd probably have to say that none of them were friends. The only relationship that came close to being a friend relationship was between Eisenhower and Patton. And later that ended with kind of catastrophically for Patton's bad behavior. And but other than that, but they used each other brilliantly. They were involved in a kind of mass symbiosis over time. MacArthur rises very fast. He discovers Eisenhower and the fact that he can write. He gets together with him. At some point, Eisenhower meets Marshall, and Marshall remembers him and calls him in and basically says, I'll give me a strategy for the Pacific War, would you? And Eisenhower had the good sense to say, well, I think I need about 2 hours and a typewriter for that. And so they formed a team. And back earlier, Eisenhower didn't end up going to war. He ended up in an equally dangerous assignment because of the Spanish flu, and he being a camp commander was ridden with Spanish flu, killed a lot of guys and might have killed him, but he felt bad about it. But Patton had a fairly glorious career in World War I and came back. They were both interested in tanks, so they met at the tank center, and they forged a friendship pretty quickly that kept both of them kind of together. And George Marshall was interspaced with all of these people too. And but interestingly enough, Marshall and MacArthur actively disliked each other. And MacArthur always believed that Marshall was out to get him, despite the fact that Marshall never did anything really to provoke MacArthur, and actually was extraordinarily temperate towards MacArthur when he had the power probably to break him if he wanted to, but he never did.
So one of the concepts that you bring out in the very beginning of the book, before you get into each of this timeline and put them together or separately during the war, is about masks. And you mention that, along the lines of John Keegan's famous book, The Mask of Command, that commanders of this rank, of this high rank, they needed to kind of have a mask on at all times, in front of the troops, in front of their peers, in front of even perhaps FDR as well. What is the concept about masks, and how did that play into being a commander?
Well, it probably always did. I mean, in order to talk a group of young males into the proposition of risking their lives, you have to appear almost superhumanly confident. And that requires a certain type of personality, but it also requires the cultivation of that personality. And at this point in time, too, masks were perhaps becoming even more important because of the electronic projection. And the fact that commanders could now, for instance, a simple matter of microphones. Prior to this, commanders always used to give inspiring speeches, but nobody heard them. You know, a few people heard him and said, "Oh yeah, it was great. Wellington really could talk, man." But nobody really heard those people. But suddenly in this 20th century era, voices were suddenly louder, visual images were louder. And this was important because armies were huge and you had to bring them together. And that's what the mask of command was truly for. And these four guys, in one way or another, could project that image of supreme leadership, gigantic leadership, that would be able to bring, you know, a group of several 100,000 people with several months of military training, frequently no combat experience, drawn out of civilian life, somehow together and saying there, "We're the Fifth Army, we roll with Patton." And that's what the mask was and how it worked. And John Keegan's concept, he was really probably the greatest military historian of my era. And this was one of his best concepts, and I shamelessly used it in this book.
As you were developing this theme and you were thinking about it, did you consider putting Bradley in there with these four other generals? Was that ever under consideration? If not, why not?
Well, as I said, it came to me as an impulse. It literally did. I didn't calculate this at all. Those names just jumped into my mind. And Bradley didn't jump into my mind. So that would be my first answer. But having examined the subsequent career of Omar Bradley, I'd have to say I'm glad I didn't include him. He made as many mistakes as he made good moves. You know, he was responsible for letting his branch of the Normandy invasion out 12 miles offshore in these small landing craft. But he certainly more than made up for that with Operation Cobra at Normandy, which caused the basic breakout that allowed us to, you know, metastasize all over occupied France, which was brilliant. But his performance at the Battle of the Bulge was bad enough that I had to put Montgomery temporarily in charge, and it was a signal moment. He said to Ike, said I have to do this, you know, and he said, "Well, if you do this, I can't be responsible to the American people." And Ike said, "Never forget, I'm the one that's responsible for the American people," and that was it. And you know, he just wasn't of their caliber. Patton was crazy. Well, you know, he really, by many standards, Patton really was crazy, but he was also a really brilliant combat leader. Maybe the best field general the United States ever had. And when you have quality, that kind of quality, and you compare Bradley to them or him, it just doesn't match up.
Got it. So let's talk a little bit about their backgrounds. Did these four generals have similar backgrounds, similar pre-war careers, or were they? I know you talked about Eisenhower's poverty, and that MacArthur was certainly not impoverished at all. But did they have any other similarities before World War II?
Yeah, absolutely. The way I set it up in the book, and I think is largely true, is that Marshall, MacArthur, and Patton all came from essentially upper class, or very much upper middle class. And Patton family was obscenely wealthy. I mean, they basically, the ranch that Patton grew up in occupied what is now Pasadena, California. So, I mean, Patton was really wealthy, and the others were. The Eisenhowers had what might be called genteel poverty, except it was not genteel based, it was religious based. The both Ike's family were intensely religious, lived in a religious environment, and but they were college educated, and they were also very virtuous people. So their poverty was not disgraceful at all. It was just like they didn't have a lot of stuff, and they were stuffed together, a lot of them stuffed together in a little house, but they managed to make it work.
So, what would you say were the common characteristics, the common aspects of leadership that these four generals had that made them part of this Team America?
Well, in they kind of break up into halves. There were the combat leaders. One of the interesting things I found out that I didn't know, but was true, was that neither Ike nor Marshall were ever actually in combat. They were close to combat. They wanted to be in combat. They actually were in a number of fairly ridiculously dangerous activities, mostly flying around in planes without radar. So they were all brave men, but it really did break down that Patton and MacArthur were extraordinary combat leaders. And they were frequently faced dangerous situations. And one of the things I thought was really kind of interesting was that they got shot at a variety of times. And all throughout George Patton's life, he did kind of heroic activities on the backs of horses, a variety of other things. He almost always got hurt. And he was badly wounded in World War I. And he basically, he was brave, and he knew the physical consequences of bravery. And on the other hand, Douglas MacArthur, he and George Washington were the two bulletproof humans in American history. Shot at many times, never hit. In fact, at the beginning of the series of quotes I have about these guys, in fact, I might go ahead and read these. These are quotes that I thought would epitomize the personalities of these different people. And the first is comes from George Patton. I'll go through those Germans like crap through a goose. And George Marshall was, I save my emotions for Mrs. Marshall. And the third one was from Dwight Eisenhower's son, John, make that 75% cold-blooded. Dwight Eisenhower's son, John, when he was asked to balance his father's open and sunny side with his calculating nature. And finally, Douglas MacArthur, young man, that bullet was not meant for me. And it really did seem that there were two visions of bravery here. On the other hand, Eisenhower and Marshall, their qualities were inspirational and organizational. They knew how to put an army together like nobody else did. And the thing that's important to understand here is we live in an era, truly an era of computers. In fact, with this latest generative artificial intelligence, I'm thinking probably that in the future, people will order up a history by Bob O'Connell, and the AI will just produce it in probably 25 minutes on any subject you need. Probably be quite a bit better than what I produced in my lifetime. But in the meantime, we're stuck with me. But these guys were that way. They were doing it without computers. Marshall and Eisenhower, they were doing it by strength of character, understanding what forms of organization worked best for the kind of people they had and the kind of situation they were faced with. And as I said, a sort of awesome gravitas that made people do what they wanted. Mm. So they were George Patton and MacArthur were the sluggers, and I suppose Ike and Marshall were the fireball or pitchers.
Mm-hmm. Now, what came across to me when I was reading the book was that they didn't all have the same view about civil-military relations and dealing with civilians, dealing with the president and the secretaries. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how MacArthur saw his role, and was he different than Eisenhower and Marshall?
Yeah, I think he was. He had an almost imperial personality. So he ended up in a position of extraordinary power. He became the most powerful man in American history and will probably remain that, in that he was the absolute ruler of not only Japan, which people perhaps remember, but also the Philippines. Although he delegated that responsibility, and quickly the Philippines went through the process of independence very rapidly, which MacArthur was always for. But back in Japan, he was the rising sun king, and he made vast changes in their society. But that experience, if anything else, hadn't turned Douglas MacArthur into his own mask. He was the mask at that point, and he couldn't see the difference between himself and the mask, and that's what caused his downfall. But he was different from them in that regard. I took himself seriously, deeply seriously, but he always, I wouldn't say he had the ability to laugh at himself, but he presented himself in a way to people that it was one of almost friendship, which it frequently wasn't, of course, but you know, he loved to be called Ike, and he'd tell anybody to call him Ike, you know, and they sometimes people would be completely disarmed by this, except for one guy, which is Marshall, who always referred to him as Eisenhower. And Eisenhower jokingly once said that he slipped. One time Marshall called him Ike, and Eisenhower was amused that for the next 20 minutes, he bombarded him. Every time he mentioned him, rather than you, he said, Eisenhower, do this, Eisenhower, do that, Eisenhower, as if to blot it out. So again, you know, these guys were, they were powerful, important men. And, you know, I think George Marshall was always basically, Marshall had Eisenhower's back, and that was true vice versa, but they were not friends.
Yeah. How did President Roosevelt look at these four? Is there much evidence about how he looked at each of them as while he was president during the war, or Truman for that matter?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of evidence about all four. One is interesting. Of all the four, you would think that he would hate Patton. You know, Patton was extremely conservative in terms of his politics and his racial attitudes, et cetera, but weirdly, Patton's wife, Beatrice, who was complimented George's fortune by also being exceptionally wealthy, she somehow fell into league with Eleanor Roosevelt through her great horse riding. And she and Eleanor became fast friends. So it turned out Roosevelt kind of liked Patton, and Patton would, you know, he was an over-the-top kind of personality that Roosevelt appreciated. Just before the North African invasion, the naval commander and Patton went to the White House, and Patton said, well, how will you do? And he said, I'll deliver North Africa to you, or I'll die on the beach, Mr. President. And that's the kind of stuff FDR loved. As far as Marshall, one of FDR's best qualities was he really read people well. And he understood Marshall was supremely competent. He was mystified by Marshall because Marshall made no effort to befriend him or do anything, and always refused to visit him up at Campobello or down at Hot Springs. But nonetheless, he really appreciated Marshall and Marshall's judgment and his ability to cut through problems and prioritize, because that's what a manager needs, is a team captain who knows what he's doing. But on the other hand, there was the charm of Ike, and Roosevelt flew in on his way to meeting subsequent in Cairo, and ultimately in Tehran, summits there. And Ike met him at the battleship. Actually, he floated in on a brand new battleship, and he ended up taking him on this ride around what had formerly been Carthage, and talking about the battles that had been fought for Carthage and the First and Second and Third Punic War. Now, Roosevelt was America's first history buff. He loved this stuff, and this was the first time he met Eisenhower. He'd been in charge of the North. This was the first time he had any significant time with Eisenhower. Eisenhower had been in charge of the North Africa campaign, and at times it looked like it was going south, and he wondered about Eisenhower's competence. But this is the first time he really got to know him. And at the end of that visit, he invited Eisenhower to come to the Cairo conference with him. And it's pretty clear at that point, he realized that he wasn't going to have Marshall run the Normandy invasion. It was going to be Eisenhower. So Eisenhower's magnetic personality really won Roosevelt over. And Marshall, to his great credit, just shrugged his shoulders and said, you know, I want to do my job the best I can. If you need me in Washington, he told Roosevelt said, I won't sleep at night if you're not in Washington. So he said, well, you know, you got to get some sleep, so I'll come back.
Question I had for you is, I highlighted it somewhere, and I don't want to take up folks' time trying to find out, but you described these four as the finest military leaders in military history, or at least U.S. military history. Were there comparable folks in the Navy that also contributed this kind of level?
Well, you know, I think that one of the things I was thinking about as I was writing this book was that the naval campaigns of World War II were strange. And they were strange in large part because the Navy had perpetuated the myth of the all big gun battleship well beyond its lifespan. And that led to the situation where Japanese aircraft carriers were able to successfully attack the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. And from that moment, first thing that happened that was very beneficial is they sank a lot of battleships and not aircraft carriers, because that was what was needed. That and submarines. The war in the Pacific was largely won by the submariners, and they had developed an exceptionally good submarine, patrol class submarine, not a huge fleet submarine like the battleship guys wanted to use them to protect the battleships. But these things not only they included two key innovations, incidentally, that the Navy sponsored. One was diesel engines to run them more efficiently, and they worked that through the railways. And the railways and the Navy cooperatively developed these high-powered diesels that were able to be very reliable in the Pacific. The second one, which proved almost equally vital, was air conditioning. And that enabled our Navy to really clean the Japanese merchant fleet out of business and basically starve their empire. But because the Navy had lost these battleships, they did actually build more battleships, or at least plan to, and the ones they were building, they let to come to fruition. But we emphasized carriers from that point on. And the other thing the Navy emphasized was revenge. They wanted to destroy the Japanese fleet. So a lot of their strategy was posed by that. And actually, the point of all of this is, despite the fact that there were admirals like Halsey and Nimitz who were excellent, strategically, they didn't contribute that much. Actually, MacArthur, using much less resources, was much more effective at basically isolating and using the Japanese. Now, all this is conditioned by the fact that we had this extraordinary intelligence advantage in ultra. So everybody could be a good leader.
Mm-hmm. All right. Got a couple of questions before I ask a few more here. I just want to make sure. One of our audience members writes that you describe Eisenhower as the pivot man in Team America, but he did not have to deal with MacArthur. And Marshall had to deal with all three. Why wouldn't Marshall be the pivot man? That's the question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, first, you need to understand that Eisenhower had a close relationship with MacArthur, which went through MacArthur's literally his period as chief of staff, and then MacArthur went to the Philippines, eventually became the head of the Philippine Army. But during that period, Eisenhower followed him to the Philippines. So Eisenhower's relationship there. The other factor would be that Eisenhower and MacArthur had some sort of relationship. MacArthur actively hated Marshall. So I suppose it's tough to be a pivot man when one of your players is not cooperating with you. And he really, at one point, this was epitomized at after this the second Cairo conference, when Marshall finds out that he's not going to be the head of Overlord, which was the campaign against to land at Normandy. He finds that out. He decides, rather than go home from Cairo going west, he would go east, and he would go and visit MacArthur. During that flight, incidentally, he was flying in one of MacArthur's minions' planes, and they were flying at about 4,000 feet, and a chance bolt of lightning revealed that there was a mountain right in front of them, and they barely pulled up. Had it not been for that lightning bolt, that would have been the end of George Marshall. But anyway, he goes all this way to meet MacArthur, and MacArthur's not there. He's gone off to this place called Goodenough Island to supposedly supervise a small invasion. He basically thumbs his nose at George Marshall, stands him up, So Marshall literally goes to Goodenough Island, and even then MacArthur wanted to bolt, but he stayed, and they had a kind of cold lunch. At one point, he said, "I want to introduce you to my staff," MacArthur said, and Marshall said, "George, you don't have a staff, you have a court here." And but given all that and that provocation, still, when he got back, he said, the first thing we need to do is get MacArthur some better fighter aircraft and more of them. And he did it. He made every effort to reinforce the Southwest Pacific with what he had. MacArthur got a lot less than the other guys, but after that kind of provocation to do that, it sort of shows you what sort of man Marshall was. But the problem was that MacArthur was convinced that Marshall was always out to get him.
Well, can you talk a little bit as we wind down here? The Patton, as most of us know, died before the war was over. But what about the post? And we know that obviously Eisenhower was president, Marshall, Secretary of State, Marshall Plan. What was the trajectory? How was the trajectory of their careers after World War II different from each other? Was kind of MacArthur a little bit? I mean, obviously we know about his Korean War experience. He stayed in the military. Was there anything striking to you about how their careers went after World War II?
Well, I think that MacArthur revealed himself in his final episodes as the imperial ruler of Japan, and then he reached the kind of apotheosis of his military career with the landing at the Incheon Peninsula that led to him taking over most of North Korea. But he wouldn't stop, and he literally, that was the moment, his moment of tragedy, and the that Eisenhower never fell prey to that, nor did Marshall. They were much more flexible people. And Marshall was fascinating in his career. Now, his health was not great. That was one of the problems. He was kind of a worn out man, and he really looked forward to being to ending his career in the Army. And 2 days after he retired, Truman called him up and asked him to go as a special representative to China. And he still didn't escape. As soon as he got back from that, he became Secretary of State. But he was a tired man, and in that case, one of the things that George Marshall was really, really good at was delegation. So he tended to find people who could do the work for him. And he never intentionally took credit either. The story of the Marshall Plan was largely the story of George Kennan and Dean Acheson that began to think that the best way to reinvigorate Europe was not to fight communism, but to economically inject money into Europe. And Marshall jumped at this idea. He saw these people as brilliant, even though he was a military man. He actually reorganized the State Department much like he would a military organization. But in that process, he created this policy planning group, and Kennan was head of it. And these guys were just, brilliant. They knew exactly what to do, and Marshall went along with it, and that became his famous speech at Harvard, which led to it being called the Marshall Plan. But he was able to go from a military to a highly civilian organization like state and blend in perfectly. And Eisenhower was the same way. He wore the presidency like a pair of really comfortable slippers. He knew exactly what to do, and he was a savvy guy, but he was a natural, in many ways, a natural politician. And again, he adjusted to a civilian environment far better than MacArthur could have or ever did, really.
One last question, Bob. regarding Patton. Now, I realize this calls for total speculation, but what role had he lived through the war, what role do you think he would have played in the Cold War, either as a soldier, civilian, government leader? What do you think he would have wound up doing?
I really think that there was a place for George Patton at the side of Joseph McCarthy. And that, as a kind of tag team, would have been an ugly spectacle indeed. I don't know if it would have gotten as bad as we've recently experienced, but Patton had no trouble calling anybody a communist, I'm sure. And also, there is, he's on record as saying one of the things that, the thing that got him truly fired from his command in Bavaria was that he at a news conference, he basically compared former Nazis to Republicans and Democrats. But they had a recorded conversation with between Patton and one of Eisenhower's lesser generals. And he's saying, we got to get these Nazis together. We got to get these stormtroopers together. We got to rearm them, and we got to turn them against the Russians. We got the Russians down now. We need to finish them off. And the Germans will be great to do that because they hate Russians. And this guy literally, this wasn't a setup at all. He didn't expect this, or Eisenhower, or nobody. And the guy said, "George, shut up, you fool." And it was like, he was like 2 stars below George when he said this, So, I mean, Patton would have been, he was fairly unstable guy, and I don't know how great his health was. I guess it was, but he wouldn't have lasted long in the military. He knew that, and he offered to go to the Pacific Theater, and nobody took him up on that offer. So he had a very limited future. He knew he was going to be out of the Army. So, he was a well-known figure, a right-winger. He might well have fallen into the anti-communist movement pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm. Robert O'Connell, author of Team America, thanks for being with us this evening. We really appreciate your time, and a lot of great things to think about. And I know the audience certainly appreciates that. Again, Bob, thanks again for joining us, and we appreciate your time, and we were glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you, John. I appreciate the opportunity of being able to do this. So good night.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, folks, we'll see you at a future program, and thanks for joining us, and have a great night.